for inviting us. We're very pleased and honored to be here. I'm saying us because my co-author Paul Gabret is also here, and I'll do most of the work of answering the questions. How about that?
Sounds familiar.
Yes, I got the tip about that. And Paul is a psychoanalyst. For many years, I did statistical work in international trade and finance, and not too long ago, I got a degree in psychoanalysis as well. So as a result of all this long journey and my co-authorship with Paul, before then I had started getting interested in Adam Smith, and Paul became a collaborator, and we embarked on this project, and the paper I'm going to present today is will be revised to be part of a book that's coming out of Routledge early next year, hopefully. And the longer title of the paper, I should also say, I know why we're invited, because we're young, not age-wise, not because of last names, but because we're young to the field. So knowing that, even though I ask that the questions, I would prefer the questions are asked at the end or comments are made at the end, if there are any errors, if there are any omissions or anything you wish to say immediately, please feel free to interrupt me. And we're looking forward to your comments and questions. So with that, let me just go back to stating that there's a subtitle which is quite explanatory. It says Evolutionary Psychology and Adaptive Defenses Perspectives on Delayed Gratification and Trust. So, very specific title. Let me first start with some introductory remarks. Adam Smith's groundbreaking work on morality and moral structure and the influence of such morality on economic theory have been well examined over the past 200 years. In particular, the effects of markets and morality on markets have been discussed as well. It has been recognized that while Smith was not writing as a psychologist, there are a number of applied psychological constructs embedded in his philosophical writing. Smith's theoretical writings predated the opening of the first laboratory experimental psychology by over 100 years, and the first writing in psychoanalysis by almost 120 years. In this paper, we're attempting to examine some of the embedded psychological concepts that are active in his theoretical writings and looking at how they would operate in relation to his understanding of morality and markets. While it has been acknowledged that there's a moral psychology embedded in Smith's work, to date, there has not been any treatment of this work in the literature from the perspective of evolutionary psychology or from the perspective of psychoanalytic adaptive defenses. In this paper, we attempt to explicate some of the embedded psychological processes in Smith from a perspective of evolutionary psychology and psychoanalysis. Specifically, we examine the role of adaptive defenses play in the evolution of the psychological capacities for delayed gratification and development of trust. We then discuss the role these psychological variables play in relation to the application of morality to markets and the reciprocal effects of markets and morality in Smith's work. The evolutionary psychologist Dennis Krebs contends mechanisms that give rise to a moral sense evolved to help early humans solve the adaptive problems that constrain their ability to reap the benefits of sociality. Self-control is one of those mechanisms. The capacity for self-control in the evolutionary psychology literature is analogous to what Smith refers as self-command. One definition of evolutionary psychologists give of self-control is that it is a cognitive process that is used to delay gratification and sustain commitments. Delayed gratification makes possible the adaptive capacity to store food for the winter to enable the survival of the individual or the group as a whole. Often a high price is paid when self-control is lacking. For example, the inability of the individual or group to survive. Most forms of self-control and delayed gratification are described as prudential because urges are controlled to improve one's ability to maximize long-term gains. An important extension of the capacity for delayed gratification and development of morality is the effect that such capacity and behavior has on building trust. When we consider the effects that morality has on markets and markets have on morality, probably one of the most important factors that allows markets to thrive is trust. Adaptive defenses describe the means for individuals to adapt morality so that it can be used both personally and interpersonally. Over time, the consensually adapted understandings develop into moral structures that attempt to define the ideal interactions between people, and defenses are the action mechanisms that help to implement morality within the person. For instance, the instinctual need and desire for the immediate acquisition of food can be acted upon by simply taking it. This action, however, would inhibit a trading partner from wanting to do business in the future and may even bring other social sanctions. The ability to suppress, rationalize, or otherwise contain that immediate impulse for a long enough period of time to find a mutually agreed upon way to trade another commodity or service for that food allows for mutual benefit and for the establishment of a consensual morality by which to conduct such trades in the future. Now, depending on how long this will take, I might be brief on some sections. We have a couple sections that are coming up. First, I'll briefly touch upon Smith, not long because sympathy, for example, has already been discussed at length here. In the following section, I'll talk about evolutionary psychology and adaptive defenses. There's a section which is mostly a literature review on morality and markets. I might not go through that entire section, but just give you a list because it's primarily secondary literature. After we go through all of that, we get to the meat of the paper, for which I want to make sure we have enough time, and that enough time for the discussion. So, basically, we know that sympathy is the foundation of morality in Smith, and we know how it is through the interaction of the spectator and the agent that there's a moral consensus. So I will not go into that. There's a brief description of it in the paper, and we're actually in the process of writing a paper on sympathy from an intersubjectivist point of view, in which we'll go into that dynamics from a more psychoanalytically oriented perspective. But a few things in the Smith section that I'd like to point out is on virtue, because we touch upon the importance of these later in the main body of the paper. Even though virtue is the cornerstone of the TMS, and it really is looked at through the entirety of it, and Griswold has an excellent book on that, so does Henley. In the character of virtue part, which is part 6 of the book, he talks about prudence affecting the health, affecting the happiness of others, and also self-command. I want to say just a few words about those. According to Smith, obtaining rank and credit among our equals is the strongest of all our desires. This depends on our character and conduct. Smith defines prudence with the following statement: the care of health, of the fortune, of the rank and reputation of the individual, the objects upon which his comfort and happiness in this life are supposedly principally to depend, is considered as the proper business of that virtue which is called prudence. Well, the first object of prudence is security, and he goes at length talking about many attributes of prudence, and one that is especially important for us is a man sacrificing present enjoyment for future. Delayed gratification is in that long list of aspects of the prudent man, which I won't go into, and we listed some of them in the paper. Affecting others' people happiness, and here benevolence, he talks about how people initially care about the immediate family, and then there's an extending circle of care. And he also talks about universal benevolence. Self-command, which is important for us. A few words on that. For Smith, self-command is required to be virtuous because men are likely to be misled by their own passions. Smith does not place merit in acting according to prudence, justice, and benefice when one is not tempted to do so otherwise. There is merit in acting according to them in the middle of the greatest difficulties and dangers, which requires self-command, as he calls the awful and respectable virtue. He says self-command is not only itself a great virtue, but from it all the other virtues seem to derive their principal luster. Mere propriety may require ordinary degree of self-command. Virtue, on the other hand, requires greatest exertions of self-command. We acquired from that great discipline, quoting Smith, which nature has established for the acquisition of this and of every other virtue, a regard to the sentiments of the real or supposed spectator of our conduct. We'll have more Smith quotes when we talk about our main body, but this is all I want to touch upon in terms of virtue in Smith for now. Moving to evolutionary account of morality and adaptive defenses, first starting with evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology provides a perspective on how morality develops in the context of human evolution. Krebs defines morality as a set of ideas about how people who live in groups should behave in order to meet their needs and advance their interests in cooperative ways. Haidt states that morality mediates unbridled selfishness, which makes social life and cooperative communities possible. Moral behavior is about how members of groups ought to behave, which is reinforced by social sanctions. Morality evolved to help people achieve adaptive goals and solve adaptive problems. Prosocial behavior, structures, and moral reasoning and virtues help foster their inclusive fitness, survive, and reproduce. However, people can seek to achieve goals using immoral means, demonstrating that the goals alone do not qualify as moral. Thus, morality is about the means people use to achieve the goals they endeavor to achieve. In evolutionary theory, a moral person is simply one who pursues their ultimate genetic self-interest through psychological adaptations that embody a genuine, proximate concern for others. Virtues can be considered sources of moral behavior. Rather than anchoring morality in behavior, anchoring it in virtues leads us to focus on the intentions, say evolutionary psychologists. The key to understanding morality from this perspective requires an understanding of how mental processes that produce moral norms, moral behaviors, emotional judgments serve as adaptive functions. Solving adaptive problems to reap the benefits of sociality is achieved through the evolution of mechanisms that give rise to moral sense. It goes then that human behavior that increases the cooperative possibilities between people also requires us to be aware of and exercise restraint of purely individual needs. Learning theory, teaches us that such cooperative behavior in individuals must be rewarded within groups or cultures in order for it to continue. In particular, the behavior or set of behaviors that need to evolve within groups or individuals are those which allow for enough delayed gratification for them to reap the self-interested benefits of cultural morality. This necessarily means that structural forms must evolve which teach or otherwise acculturate the individuals within those cultures to reap the benefits of such civilizing processes. Behaving in mutually beneficial ways while restricting the temptation to advance our own interests at the cost of the welfare of others and the social order of their group morality helps people to maximize their gain from cooperative social relations. Evolutionary psychologists suppose that environment interacts with genetics to produce mental mechanisms that enable moral judgments, behaviors, and emotions. Mental mechanisms are themselves products of evolution. From the perspective of genetic evolution, one can infer that those genetic capacities that allow humans to make adaptations to communal living would enable a greater survival in a group life than those who did not. It's put concisely by the statement that early humans who inherited genes that design mechanisms that dispose them to behave in moral ways and endowed them with a sense of morality fared better in the struggle to survive and to reproduce than early humans who did not inherit such genes. At the same time, moral reasoning may be incidental, even maladaptive, byproducts of reasoning mechanisms that evolved to serve other adaptive purposes. Evolutionary psychologists also expect that moral decision-making strategies to be conditional and flexible and be based on if-then trigger, which pertains, if-then sequence, which pertains to an environmental trigger. Identification of goals is also important as mechanisms evolve to achieve the goals that are set aside. Finally, moral feelings, thoughts, and actions are mediated through a variety of hormonal, emotional, cognitive, and neurological processes. Deference and self-control are among primitive prosocial behaviors according to evolutionary psychologists. Understanding the evolutionary roots of these is important as they play a key role in Smith's moral system. Deference is defined as deferring to authority and obeying the rules of one's group. Deference, which has neurological and hormonal roots, enables the subordinate members of a group to fight for another day. It has evolved starting with the animal kingdom. As it is put, by submitting, the loser is able to walk away alive and injury-free. In humans too, status hierarchies and dominant structure relationships among members of groups creates a social order. Individuals must obey the social order of their groups and enforce their group rules to maximize gains from group living, which leads to moral evolution. Its emotional roots of deference are rooted in fear or awe. Self-control has an important function in survival and reproduction. From an evolutionary perspective, genes regulate urges and motivational systems in order to survive and reproduce. Most forms of self-control are described as prudential. It's argued that modern humans have some self-indulgent traits that work better in early environments than modern environments. On the other hand, modern humans who are endowed with large brains are better able to cope with their primitive urges. Delayed gratification is considered to be one of the most important components of cognitive control. I'll skip a paragraph. It's about various, well, I'll say it anyway. I still have time. Self-control is a capacity that tends to increase as people grow older, such as older children having more self-control than younger children. It's stable over time, and it is correlated with social adjustment and success. Individuals exhibit variations of self-control. For example, five correlates have been identified: intelligence, ego control, orientation towards the future, achievement of aspiration, and social responsibility. It is influenced both by one's own group as well as their self-awareness. It's also found that when people set goals relevant to their sense of self-control improves. Finally, people do not always show optimal levels of self-control. This is attributed to the mismatch of opportunities and demands in modern world and mechanisms that evolved in ancestral environments. On the issue of altruism, evolutionary psychologists point out that humans are strongly inclined to help their kin and more strongly inclined to help their in-group members than out-of-group members, just as in Smith. Though many people are inclined to help strangers as well. Individuals help themselves and their relatives to propagate their genes. Altruistic dispositions could evolve from kin selection and sexual selection. There is a paragraph on brain. I'll skip that one. Let me move to adaptive defenses. We next clarify the meaning of defenses by looking at the development of this concept in psychoanalysis. Initially, the term resistance and defenses were used interchangeably. In that context, it was seen as a negative force, and defenses were employed by the individual, consciously and or unconsciously, to resist psychoanalytic interpretations. As the understanding of defenses evolved, several important psychoanalysts looked to free ego from an impossible subordinate role to instincts. In other words, Anna Freud is described as having said that she showed the ego and it's working in a new light. Whereas previously, the ego's defenses had been regarded as obstacles to successful therapy, she showed that these resistances were, in fact, highly adaptive, at least in their origins. She further demonstrated that each individual's defenses, intellectualization, reaction formation, ego restriction, and so forth, were characteristic to his total adaptation to life, forming a distinctive part of his personality. These defensive adaptations were shown to manage deep emotional affect as well as managing anxiety and ambiguity in daily life struggles. Psychological defense mechanisms represent an important component of our capacity to maintain emotional homeostasis. Defense mechanisms evolve and operate much like the immune system without our conscious awareness. To recap, defenses were originally viewed as the unconscious mechanisms that contained and reflected disturbing impulses and drives. However, as psychoanalytic theory evolved, defense mechanisms came to be viewed as having adaptive values. It's stated that defenses have a dual function. On the one hand, they are in the service of constructive, maturational, progressive growth and mastery of the drives, and they have an autonomous adaptive function. On the other hand, they ward off anxieties in relation to unconscious conflict. It is these same mechanisms that serve both defensive and adaptive purposes, either singly or together, sequentially or simultaneously. Any behavioral expression can serve as adaptive, defensive, or impulsive, again, simultaneously or sequentially. As human capacities have evolved and have integrated more civil behavior, the mechanisms for accommodating the immediate tension and discomfort of such pro-social behavior needed to evolve too. These adaptive defenses play a key role in the assimilation of more complex sets of behavior that go into moral structure. Defensive mechanisms have evolved to reduce the intensity, frequency, and duration of adverse state feelings. The adoption of moral behavior in the marketplace and elsewhere requires the individual to contain immediate emotional impulses and desires for gratification and reduce the intensity of their frustration that arising from not gratifying these needs immediately. The use of defensive processes are an integral component in mediating an immediate desire and delaying its gratification. This delay of gratification is then reinforced by the positive consequences that such an ability has on fulfilling interactive agreements and building trust in the public square and marketplace. It's indicated that environmental situations often play a part in determining the need for adaptation. Underlying the concept of adaptation is that living organisms come to fit their environment. Adaptation is a reciprocal relationship between the environment and the organism. Adaptation may result from the changes which the individual places upon the environment. In doing so, humans adapt the environment to human functions, and then the human being adapts to the environment he created. It's also stated that man acquires a crucial part of his adaptation through a learning process. Both constitutional factors and the external environmental influence the process of adaptation. Hereditary factors, tradition, and survival all impact how a man adapts to his environment. From the beginning of life, the task of man to adapt is present. He stresses that the primary importance of social factors in human development and their biological significances as important for adaptation. There could also be progressive and regressive adaptations. An individual gains increasing independence through evolution. Thus, the reactions that originally occurred in relation to the external world are increasingly displayed into the interior of the organism. Now, we have this section with a number of quotes from Smith and review of the secondary literature. I'll skip that because I'd like to take another 15 or maybe 20 minutes for presentation to have enough room for discussion. If I'm asked later on, we can go back to this section. But let me just highlight a few things about this section very briefly. It's called Reciprocal Relationship Between Markets and Morality, based on Smith's writing. So it's not the entirety of the secondary literature on markets and morality. First, there's discussion from the relationship from morality to markets. In particular, we point out, as has been pointed out, the role of justice. And secondly, what absence of morality does to markets, like reducing it to a mercantile system. Then the next section addresses the relationship moving from markets to morality. Well, markets may foster morality or undermine morality. So we look at both. In terms of markets fostering morality, one thing that's been pointed out by Rosenberg, 1990, I believe, is the impact it has on the building of moral capital. Middle class domination in commercial societies is considered moral by Smith. Corrupting bonds of feudal ties are no longer present in commercial societies. Disposition towards laziness that dominated the feudal system, agricultural system, is no longer there. With increased commercial markets, profits increase, which gives incentives to parsimony and frugality. Probity and punctuality increases, and only under competitive conditions, we should also point out that only under competitive conditions, markets are a builder of moral capital, because wealth is inherently corrupting, according to Smith. Markets undermining morality. If there's no competition, there could be monopolies, high profits, parsimony decreasing, for example. Extended division of labor, as Smith calls the workers, become stupid or ignorant. And it's been pointed out by Rosenberg in a 1969 paper that basically the ties of families are not as strong as they used to be, because family members don't need each other for security reasons anymore. All right, so the main body of our paper, putting all of this together and making our arguments. Oops, where's that? I'm still in the market morality section. All right. This is on page 29 of the paper, if you have a printed copy of the paper. The first subsection is called delayed gratification, self-command. Well, no, it's delayed gratification and self-command mostly, and then we talk a bit about trust, and then we have a section on trust, a subsection on trust. We propose that the reciprocal effects of markets on morality and morality on markets and markets on morality are facilitated by important psychological mechanisms that are embedded in Smith's work, in particular the capacity for delayed gratification, self-command, and trust. In an earlier section, we stated that from the evolution of human psychology, a key element in the exercise of morality is that individuals must first have the capacity to resist the temptation to immediately satisfying their own needs at the expense of others. This significant skill in the evolution of human psychology is contingent on the adaptive defenses that allow them, when necessary, to resist the need for immediate gratification in favor of meeting more prolonged term goals, such as moral behavior. In addition, evolutionary psychology also points out that the genetic capacity that allowed humans to delay immediate gratification and enabled social cooperation and group living was reinforced for reflection and the growth of moral structure that served the specific needs of individuals and groups. The emotional tension that is generated between individual desire to immediately gratify self-interest needs at the expense of others, and the competing needs engendered by consensual or moral structures reveal the need for adaptive defenses to mediate the conflict. The ability to suppress and or rationalize the need to immediately act upon self-interest facilitates the redirection of those impulses in favor of long-term moral goals. Adaptive defenses manage the immediate impulses or needs. This ability for restraint, once again, creates the necessary psychological preconditions for the exercise of the moral virtues that Smith has clearly laid out. Self-command, as referred to by Adam Smith, and the psychological capacity for delayed gratification are inextricably related. Without the capacity for self-command, delayed gratification is not possible. Delayed gratification, in turn, increases an individual's capacity to regulate, which facilitates further self-command. Evolutionary psychology shows how the capacity to resist the immediate satisfaction of individual needs at the expense of others allows individuals to advance their interests in cooperative ways. The ability to delay gratification and gain self-command allows for the development of morality and increases the potential for cooperative sociability. Self-command and the capacity for delayed gratification in the most practical sense make adaptation possible. For example, the long-term goal of having enough food for a cold winter requires the ability to plan for the future and look beyond the immediately gratifying circumstances of plenty. The mastery of the capacity for delayed gratification and the cognitive ability to imagine into the future are necessary for this and countless other civilizing tasks of a similar nature. Writing on the importance of self-command, Smith states that the most perfect knowledge, if it is not supported by the most perfect self-command, will not always enable him to do his duty. Furthermore, Smith states that in the steadiness of his industry and frugality, in his steady sacrificing the ease and enjoyment of the present moment for the probable expectation of the still greater ease and enjoyment of a more distant but more lasting period of time, the prudent man is always both supported and rewarded by the entire approbation of the impartial spectator and of the representative of the impartial spectator, the man within the breast. Quoting from Smith again. It is readily acknowledged that greed was adaptive in the environments in which it has evolved. In quotation, for our ancestors in a harsh world, greed paid off in the only currencies that mattered to gene survival and the ability to have offspring. From them, we have inherited greediness that manifests itself today as a desire to accumulate money and possessions. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith considers the attainment of wealth as greatness, and greatness is grand and beautiful and noble. Their attainment is well worth all the toil and anxiety which we're so apt to bestow upon it. In The Wealth of Nations, it is argued that the motive to better our condition prompts us to save. Smith argues that capital is slowly accumulated by private frugality and good conduct of the individuals by their universal and uninterrupted effort to better their condition. Thus, there's a moral basis for economic growth, which has been pointed out by Fitzgibbons before. As Smith puts it, capitals are increased by parsimony and diminished by prodigality and misconduct. Delayed gratification in terms of financial savings leads to capital accumulation that is an essential element of commercial progress and expansion of markets. Thus, we can say that this aspect of morality fosters markets. In turn, markets foster morality since the expansion of markets increases investment opportunities, giving incentives for further savings, delayed gratification. It is of course possible that investment opportunities undermine delayed gratification and lead to a corrupt behavior. Those individuals for whom the capacity to delay gratification has been compromised and or have been irresistibly tempted by rewards in the marketplace, face challenges to their moral capacity, and are the most vulnerable to self-interested behavior at the expense of others. And turning to trust, as we consider the interaction between markets and morality, we must also incorporate the development of trust. Trust is an important byproduct of delayed gratification and consistent with moral behavior. From the point of view of evolutionary psychology, the development of trust follows from mutually cooperative behavior. Experimental studies also indicate that trust follows from cooperative behavior. Initially, players cooperate without trust. Mutual trust emerges. Then cooperation is reciprocated, and it leads to sustained trust and cooperation. Initially, at least, cooperation leads to trust, not the other way around. All market exchange is intertemporal. The person moving first must trust that the other will reciprocate. To get the benefits from trade, people must overcome their desire for immediate gratification. A system of delayed gratification enables people to capture the temporal gains from exchange. Adaptive defenses have a role in the development of trust as well. For example, when individuals trade with each other, intellectualization in the ability to conceptualize the trade, and rationalization, the ability to rationalize the potential risks and benefits, are used as defenses against the impulse for immediate gratification and allows each individual to participate in trade. Repeated interactions between these traders lead to a building of trust. Each trading partner needs reasoning capacity on how to make the trade, the value, and the ability to rationalize why this should take place in an agreed upon way and in an orderly fashion. At least these two defenses that we mentioned, intellectualization and rationalization, are necessary. These defenses act in the service of delayed gratification and with repeated interactions over time build a level of trust and further the expansion of trade. These understandings from evolutionary psychology and adaptive defenses explicate the moral psychology that is embedded in Smith's work when he talks about the importance of trust as it is interwoven in human interaction. Trustworthiness is a highly valued quality, according to Smith. He says humanity does not desire to be great, but to be beloved. It is not being in the rich that truth and justice would rejoice, but in being trusted and believed recompenses, which those virtues must always acquire. He continues by saying, frankness and openness conciliate confidence. We trust the man who seems willing to trust us. We see clearly, we think, the road by which he means to conduct us, and we abandon ourselves with pleasure to his guidance and direction. Okay, I'm almost there. Adam Smith makes the following statement on commerce and trust. When a person makes perhaps 20 contracts a day, he cannot gain so much by endeavoring to impose on his neighbors as the very appearance of a cheat would make him lose, from lectures. Thus, we repeat, in commercial societies, damage to one's trustworthiness would lead to loss of business. Practically speaking, people will seek a trustworthy trading partner. Even though it may be possible to write comprehensive contracts, monitoring compliance with them can become prohibitively expensive. Frequent dealings in the marketplace may foster trust if an individual comes to believe that trading partner is trustworthy. To conduct its business in the long term, to have long-term gains, each trading partner must act in trustworthy ways. Those with the least ability to delay gratification are the most vulnerable to the corrupting effects of the marketplace and would become untrustworthy. It's been said that Smith provides a theory of rational trust, where rational trust means trust can be recommended. And Evansky, that was Bruni and Sundin, Jerry Evansky writes about trust, and he says that one of the important sources of energy in Smith's writing is based on trust, unbounded freedom, in other words. So let me go on. If over time individuals and institutions prove to be trustworthy, we trust. In a market system, if trust decreases, the transaction costs associated with protecting ourselves from the risk of immoral and unethical behavior rise. Transaction costs are lowered to the degree the regulation of markets increases trust. Civic ethics are also essential, besides the role governments may play. We point out that Arrow has written on trust as well by stating, in the absence of trust, opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation would have to be foregone. I'm skipping some things because I have only a couple minutes left. A necessary element of commercial progress is capital, and once again, trust is essential for capital. There's an incentive to accumulate capital to the degree there is trust and that the accumulated wealth will be secure. The constraints of civic ethics and positive law are the only barriers that stand between one's wealth and its loss to unconstrained greed. As has been implied in the sections above, cooperative human interaction, particularly in economic interactions, require the ability to exercise delayed gratification. In realizing the benefits of cooperative behavior in markets, markets have the reciprocal potential of reinforcing cooperative morality, therefore strengthen it. The increase of cooperative behavior over time develops trust in both cooperative behavior and in the markets that cooperative behavior fosters. As cooperative trust grows in the marketplace, this also increases the hope and possibility of reward. Conversely, because the enticement for rewards in the markets, there's a challenge to some circumvent morality. Those individuals for whom the capacity to delay gratification has been compromised are the most vulnerable to the temptations of immediate rewards at the expense of ethical constraints. When the consensual morality is breached, it weakens the trust that people have in the market, often causing a pullback or diminished participation. In order for continued participation, a renewed trust and fair play needs to be reestablished. Some form of justice needs to be applied to reassert the authority of the collective morality. And we'll skip the discussion. I'll end here.
Thank you.
Paul, do you want to come up here?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. I just have a question. You talked about, and correct me if I'm not precise on this, that those with the least ability to delay gratification will be selected out, and collective morality will emerge based on the ability, and then you have this, the prudent man is
also...
also...
you have the paper. Which page are you at?
Oh, I'm reading from page 9. He lives within his income, contented with his situation, and though he makes small accumulations that grow every day, the prudent man is also just. He does not harm others, cheat, or steal, and he does not have an ambition to dominate others. I just was wondering how we can have a cooperative morality based on the nation state, which is so far indebted in the West. How does that evolve? Or maybe you don't have an answer.
Why are we in the state we're now?
Yeah, the bankruptcy of the welfare state. evolutionary property is to the prudent.
Well, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think what we're trying to allude to at least along that line is that, you know, we're all works in progress on this in terms of managing that level of tension, okay, between, you know, morality on the one hand and those more immediate, you know, needs to be gratified. And indeed, at the moment, it would appear, based, you know, on what you're talking about, that the pendulum is a bit over in this direction, okay? I think what we all, you know, and so far we're all still here, that there is a certain level of self-correction that occurs over time, but that doesn't mean that there aren't indeed, you know, great costs, you know, that are occurred.
Well, I guess maybe to add to that, that's why, in addition to civic ethics, at least in my view too, there is some important role for government to play in these areas, like regulating the banks. Had they been regulated properly at the time, we might not have ended up in 2008. But that's going off the topic of the paper in some ways.
Right.
So you basically explained that the lesson we can take from psychology here is that moral evolution can be explained by gains from group living, right?
I'm sorry, gains from?
Group living.
Living in a group. Oh, group living.
Yeah, exactly. And I take this as a kind of prudential explanation for morals.
Yes.
And I think this is a great point and compares, for example, to modern institutional economics very well. For example, Mensa Olson, who argued for socially contrived markets, right? So I can see a connection there. But in the case of Smith, and I'm taking this from second sources, not from Smith himself, but doesn't, to some degree, for Smith always beneficial social structures, don't they kind of mirror like a natural order that is ultimately God-given? So since Smith doesn't rule out this kind of natural underlying here, it seems that he is further away from this kind of explanation than modern institutional economists.
Well, obviously we didn't think so, but I don't know how else to answer that question. I'll think about it. That's a good question.
I really ought not to be asking anything and try to read and absorb your paper, but I'm doing so because it's been a fascinating presentation. I want to just, I want to learn. And the thing which came to my mind is I heard you speak of purpose and some sort of, for want of a better expression, evolutionary rationality. And then I kept thinking, oh, but where does the unconscious fit in? I said, and where does Lacan fit in? And where does Freud fit in? So when I ran into your paper just now, and of course you have Freud, you don't have Lacan, but you have Freud. And like I say, this is not a, but to get the conversation going, I would like to put on the table, you quote Adam Smith, you say, we trust the man who seems willing to trust us. And there's a quote from PMS 398-99. And we have been taught, and I have been taught, the prisoner's dilemma game. And anybody who trusts us, you knock him out and you defect. So this is why your talk is so stimulating. In some sense, it's going against the whole tenor of the time. You know, on one hand, you are bracketing, I don't know whether you are bracketing, but my mind is, what about the unconscious, conscious, where there is no purpose and so on. And that's where we diffuse our anxieties or create our anxieties through the unconscious. And on the other hand, you are quoting this naive guy in the 18th century, who, if I'm allowed to make a travesty of him in front of experts who are here, he doesn't have a clue. Because he writes these stupid things like we trust the man who is willing to trust us. We do nothing of the kind. As soon as somebody is trustworthy, say, okay, I will bide my time and see how I can double cross him eventually. So I just wanted some reaction.
No one wants to defend Adam Smith?
Okay.
Who's next on the queue?
So one of the examples of trust betrayed in TMS is of the friend who gets murdered. And then the problem with being murdered by a friend turns out for Smith, not your own death. That's Betty. You know, there's immortality of the soul, if we believe David's interpretation of Smith on Berkeley. But it's the betrayal of friendship. Right? So he's aware that you could get kicked, and that's worse when you get kicked by somebody you trust than your own death. My question is, Smith does say what you say, but he also says something else about trust. Because the paradigmatic examples of trust in TMS are soldier to a general who willingly gets slaughtered for stupid causes. So it strikes me that Smith is aware of good trust and bad trust. I'm not saying that Smith is a pacifist, but in context it's very clear that the small people that get willingly slaughtered are not something bad's happened. I was struck, to put this in, I guess, game theoretic terms, that the account you were describing could also fit the mafia. And so I would like to have some analysis of the trust we want and the trust that's exploitable in the terms that you're doing, and maybe that will help us get Ali's question on the table.
Thank you.
Are there other comments? Jeff?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I noticed that Paul Seabright's book, The Company of Strangers, is not in your bibliography, and so I just want to draw your attention to it in case you don't already know about it, because he argues that human beings are the only species that basically cooperate among strangers. And he talks about how that the human beings accord sort of honorary friendship to people who are not genetically related to them in any way. And so I think that the issue of trust and the relationship between trust and markets needs to also incorporate the distinction between interactions between people who know each other and there's already kinship or friendship relationships and strangers. Because what makes the division of labor really take off is when you can divide it up finely enough so that people, tens of thousands of people all across the globe cooperate to make to get even a common day laborer his set of clothes and things of that nature. And so you ultimately have to get from trust to the formal rules of justice that can be enforced, or at least potentially enforced, to kind of stand behind the system of trust.
Thank you very much.
Now, this is a fascinating paper. I'm struck
Whenever
by...
people say that, I go, oh my God. It's going down.
No, it's and there's a couple things that fascinate me. One is that Adam Smith's work these days seems to resonate with people from so many different vantage points, not just ideological, which we know all about, but disciplinary, technically, that someone in a distant field from mine who reads part of Adam Smith these days is likely to find something of interest. And that is so different than it was in, say, the 1930s, where even somebody who purportedly read the book, who wrote an introduction to it, is just, oh my God, what, wow, where did this come from? And so that's just, this is an indirect, why did that happen? I mean, this is, and then following up Jeff's point is about, strangers, is what Smith says something really important, I think, when he talks about the power of systems. That we don't have time to learn about the people who are affected by legislation, so we build a system of government in which we model their, we represent them in some very parsimonious form so we can actually hold the system in our mind the way that we cannot hold their well-beings in our minds, and then so we make the jump to affection for sympathy. I say affection for system. So system becomes, and so you think, okay, so we actually don't know the first names or the second names or anything like this of the enslaved Africans, but we've got a vision of the enslaved African, and then that is gonna be a motivating force. So we make the jump to visualization. So we draw a cartoon or the Wedgworth medallion of the enslaved African, we jump to that. And that's, Smith sees that. Just talks about that. And the question then, this is back to Chris's lovely paper earlier, was, is the Wealth of Nation, in fact all of Smith's work, then a system that we can then use to model the world and then become affectionate with the system in a way we can't become affectionate with the world because it's too big? So they're just thoughts.
Just to follow up on your first comment, I mean, truly, as a novice and an outsider coming in as a psychologist and a psychoanalyst, to have read Smith's work over these past few years, I'm struck, and all of you know this here, but it bears repeating, the enormity of the task that, in my mind, he accomplished at that particular moment in time, in both the TMS and in the Wealth of Nations. It's as though, as I look back and think on it and just reading history in general, it's like he brought together so many things. Not the least of which is, morality and, fundamental economics. But again, as we're trying to explicate, in a very beginning way here, the embedded psychology that's in all of this. And indeed, in another little paper, we also talk about is that his work having to do with morality was in fact a groundbreaking forerunner to the work that Freud did 120 years later. In a very, very direct relationship. So the things that he was thinking about, the things that he was, putting together, he was a pioneer in starting this. And so, of course, there are 1,000 loose ends of which, many academics, of course, have written many thousands of papers on. But, as that kind of groundbreaking person, I was just deeply struck by the breadth and the scope of his work. And again, that was also inspiring to me to want to come forward and attempt some of this.
Can you expand a sentence or so how he anticipated Freud?
Sure. Yes, of course. Essentially, the idea of the impartial spectator that becomes internalized, we can say is a very direct forerunner of what Freud came up with in 1921, having to do with what he referred to as the superego, okay, and became part of the tripartite system of id, ego, of id, ego, and superego. Yeah.
George had a comment.
This is a fascinating paper, so thank you very much.
Two comments. I don't know how far you're going to go with these questions that you raised, but one is this. There are, then this is just stating the obvious, but there are markets, and then there are markets, and then there are markets. I mean, they operate on all different levels. In some cases, the buyer and seller are known to each other. In other cases, the relationship is arm's length. And in some cases, there may be 6 or 7 linkages between the producer of a good and the consumer of the good. So we get these long contracting chains. In the context of the crisis of 2008, economists like Amartya Sen pointed to that problem in the financial sector, this long series of exchange between the purchase of a house and the selling of a mortgage, and then the repackaging and repackaging and repackaging of financial assets that then traded without any. In those long chains, Sen said, trust is, there's no holding accountable. The moral virtues that you associate with market exchange disappear. And so in that kind of a market, these long chains of subcontracting, maybe the virtuous aspects of the market that you talk about start to get eroded. And so if you were going to go further with this, you might want to look at the different kinds of markets that arise and then ask the question whether and to what degree these different forms actually have that effect. Second point, and I'm sure you know this, but there's lots of people now, not psychologists, starting to explore the limits or the ways in which markets can sometimes crowd out virtuous behavior. So I'm thinking about the philosopher Michael Sandel at Harvard, or Ruth Grant. I think she's a political scientist, maybe philosopher, who writes about incentives and what incentives do to behavior. I know there's behavioral economists are on both sides of this issue, because in some experiments, marketization actually promotes virtuous behavior. In other cases, it seems to crowd it out. Elizabeth Anderson, the philosopher, also worries that when you bring market incentives in to social relationships that up till then have been governed by either reciprocity or gifting, that the market relationship can actually squeeze out those virtues. And I'm tempted to tell the case that everybody tells, but about the Israeli daycare center that everybody writes about, but I won't tell it because everyone's probably heard it. But the idea there also is you bring in a market incentive to solve a problem, and it can make the problem worse because it crowds out virtues that are fundamental to the way in which a daycare center should be run. So there's so much going on here in this area, so it's exciting to see.
Thank you so much for both comments. About the latter, though, in particular, we restricted the survey of the literature on that to people who've written on Adam Smith. We'll certainly look at the people you've mentioned to see if they have any focus on Adam Smith, because otherwise, as you point out, there's a vast literature out there, and we didn't want to get into that. And just one comment on the question you asked, Ali, I believe is your name. Sorry, I don't know your last name. But anyway, you were mentioned as the mathematician in the group, that's why. And of course, being from Turkey, Ali is a familiar name, so it's stuck in my mind. Anyway, just one comment to add to what Paul said. Well, actually, that the impartial spectator is analogous to superego is a comment that was made by D.D. Raphael. But we expanded and we carry it to the contemporary psychoanalysis. So we basically, it's not a novel idea, but we have another paper on empathy and sympathy. In that paper, we argue that sympathy is a forerunner of the modern psychoanalytic empathy, and that also we say in some ways Smith's theory has never been really tested, but we provide evidence from how empathy leads to prosocial behavior literature as an indirect support of the relation between sympathy and morality in Smith. So those are the directions.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. This was really fascinating.